Hi, everyone. This is Kim Wehle with Simple Politics. My guest today is Michele Gilman, my colleague at the University of Baltimore School of Law, who is an expert, among many things, in poverty law. So, welcome, Michele, to Simple Politics. Thank you for coming today.
Thanks, Kim.
So, tell our listeners what's the number one myth about low income or poor people in America?
I would say the predominant myth is the idea that poor people are lazy and that they are poor due to their own actions. And we know that this is a myth because the majority of poor people are either working but not making enough money to lift themselves above the poverty line because wages remain too low in the United States, or they're part of a group that we don't expect to work. Children, the elderly, people whose disabilities make it impossible for them to work. There are, statistically negligible numbers of people who are, able-bodied and choosing not to work and choosing to be poor. And it's a very harmful stereotype because the more we blame people for being poor, the more it gets the rest of society off the hook for coming together to solve poverty.
So, most people today who are poor are working very hard. That's your point. Unless they can't work, they're too young, they're sick, they're elderly. Um, so, where does this myth then come from? This idea of handouts, welfare being taking advantage of government. Did historically something shift in the welfare programs from the federal government? And when did that happen? How does it work today?
The real reason why Americans hate welfare, and this has been well studied, is because of race. These are very racialized notions of who is receiving welfare. And there's an idea going back really to the mid 20th century that most people who get welfare are Black, which is in fact not true. Most people who get welfare are white. But as the program became more associated in the public consciousness with Black families, as a result of racism, welfare went from being a word about helping people to a bad word, a negative word with negative connotations. President Reagan introduced the idea of the welfare queen, and that was, coded language for a Black woman with multiple children. And on the one hand, the welfare queen was a lazy mooch, but on the other hand, she was a very cunning manipulator of government largesse. There's a lot of negative stereotypes packed into that term and into that framing. And so racism is really at the bottom of a lot of American antipathy towards what we call welfare.
And so I think it probably would surprise a lot of people to hear that it was a Democratic president, Bill Clinton, who actually ended, in his words, welfare as we knew it, but really shifted the program in a way, and you can explain this perhaps, that made it where it is now, where you can have a full-time job in part and still not make it above the poverty line. Can you explain what Bill Clinton signed into law?
Sure. So Bill Clinton replaced a New Deal program called Aid to Families with Dependent Children with what's called now Temporary Assistance to Needy Families, or sometimes called TANF. That was the big welfare reform bill that was signed in 1996. And it made several changes, but I'll highlight the big ones. First, under AFDC, welfare was an open-ended entitlement, and anyone who was eligible received the assistance. Now it's structured as a block grant program to the states, and it's capped, and many eligible people do not receive assistance. Another key feature of welfare reform was that it requires work as a condition of receiving benefits. And it has a 5-year lifetime limit on receipt. And some states have a much lower limit than that, 1 or 2 years. And this makes it very challenging. So for instance, when we're working with clients who are trying to access cash assistance, in Maryland, they can only get it for 5 years in their life. And the clock is ticking each month that you receive it. But it's very hard to read into the future to know when you might need it, right? Who could have foreseen the pandemic coming and the fact that everyone would be out of work, right? So this 5-year lifetime limit sort of asks people to read into future calamities that no one can possibly do. So it's a program that serves a fraction of the people it did in its prior incarnation.
Okay, so prior to the Bill Clinton era, that Congress and Bill Clinton signing into law, if you were eligible, you got welfare, which is cash assistance for as long as you needed it. Now it goes to states. States get to decide how to dole it out, what your maximum eligibility is in terms of the number of years. So if you live in Alabama, your eligibility might be different than if you live in New York. And for everyone in the country, you can only get it for a total of 5 years throughout your entire lifetime. You can do 1 year now, another year in 5 years. And you have to be working in order to receive it. So a lot of tightening up of cash benefits. Michele, a couple questions. One is, what kind of money, if you do, for those 5 years, what kind of money are we actually talking about? And for, people like you and me who are not in sort of that low income world when it comes to raising our families, what numbers are we talking about to even potentially be eligible? What does it mean to live below the poverty line in America? What are those numbers in 2021?
Right. Well, no one is making a fortune on cash assistance. So the amounts are very small. They vary by state, again, because we have wide array of state variation in how this program is carried out. There are states where you might get $200 a month. There are states where you might get $600 a month. But even in the most generous state, that's not enough to live on. So it's a very modest amount. Now, for families who need it, it could be the difference between, making this month's rent or not. I don't want to say that it's unimportant. Each safety net program is very important and plays a role in helping people meet basic needs, but it is not a lot of money, and it is by no means enough to live on. No one could live on that amount.
So again, how is the number in terms of if you're above and below the poverty line, how is that determined? And is that formula, make sense in 2021? And could you talk a little bit about, again, numbers in terms of, we go to Starbucks, it's $6 now for a latte. What does that mean for someone who is struggling to even qualify for this $200 to $600 per month over 5 years of their lifetime while they are working? What are those? If you could put that in a little bit of perspective for those of us who aren't having to struggle in that same way.
Sure. So the poverty line is a number that is established by the U.S. Census Bureau, and the poverty line right now for a family of 4 is $26,200. And so the important thing to recognize is that a family whose income is $26,201 is not counted as poor, even though you or I would agree they're really not better off than someone making $1 less. And so we have, even if we have a number establishing what the poverty rate is, we have millions of people who we would call near poor, who aren't in that statistical grouping, but who are absolutely struggling to meet their basic needs. And the way that that number is calculated was based on a formula set in the 1960s that calculates the amount a family spends on food, the median amount, and multiplies it by 3. That made some sense in the 1960s. Food was the largest portion of a family's budget then. It makes no sense now, because now we know without a doubt the largest expenditure for a family, especially a low-income family, is housing. So the formula is very outdated. It's not how any of our peer countries calculate poverty. The Census Bureau also generates every year a measure called the Supplemental Poverty Measure that is sort of used mostly for information. It's not used by programs in awarding different benefits, but it attempts to be a more nuanced way of measuring poverty. It takes into account differences, in the cost of living between, say, New York or Arkansas. It takes into account taxes people pay, but also costs that they incur. So it's a much more nuanced number. And the poverty rate under the supplemental poverty measure tends to be a bit higher than the official poverty rate because it's just capturing more of a nuanced understanding of what it costs to live. But there's even a more important measure in my mind, and that's the self-sufficiency standard. And that's a number that economists have generated across the country on a county by county basis that actually calculates what it costs to live in a county, right? They look at the median average of housing, food, and other basic needs. It's a very bare bones budget. There's no like Red Lobster dinners in this budget. It's a very bare bones budget. And it tells us and policymakers what someone needs to make an hour in order to meet their basic needs. And, even if we get to a $15 minimum wage, which I'm sure we'll talk about, there's no jurisdiction in which that's even a living wage. So there are, it's a long way of saying there are different ways of measuring poverty, but the official way is pretty widely acknowledged as outdated.
So okay, so let's assume $15 an hour, which is at this point hasn't passed. It was cut out of the last bill that I know we're going to talk about. You're saying nowhere in the entire country is that a living wage, but you have to make something in order to qualify for what's now the current cash assistance programs. You have to be working. I know you run a clinic at the University of Baltimore with students that work a lot of these cases. Can you give us just a sort of a sense, like a storyline of, imagine you said $26,000, a family of four, say a single mom with 3 children. She has to work a job to qualify for benefits. Can you walk us through what that really looks like, what that means for that person? Do you have an example maybe from your practice that comes to mind so that we can have a little bit of empathy and understanding for what this means day to day for that woman?
Yeah. Well, what we really see it means is that parents always have to make choices about what bills to pay, and they're never able to keep up to date on all their obligations. So we have a family we're representing who forewent paying rent in order to pay utilities because they judged that they need to have the electricity on to stay warm in the winter, to keep the kids in online school during the pandemic, and that they could sort of hang in longer by paying utilities instead of rent. Some families make choices about whether to spend on food versus rent versus utilities. So it's a constant struggle in terms of how to pay bills. And that leads people often into the fringe banking economy where they're very subject to high interest loans, predatory loans that trap people in a debt cycle that they can't get out of because they're taking one loan to pay the interest on the existing loan. So it's, from what we see with our clients, it's just a constant struggle, what to pay, how to pay it. Many of them are just in a lot of debt and struggling with that and not seeing a way to get out of it. So it's very much a day-to-day struggle for survival, even if you're working.
Give us a sense of, when you say even if they're, what kind of jobs are your clients working and how many hours a week, and what does that look like? Because again, they have to work to qualify for what's left of cash assistance benefits in their particular state.
Yeah, well, a lot of low-income families are not getting cash assistance. They either choose not to apply because it's such a hassle and there's so many rules and restrictions on it, or the states have honestly in many places made it so difficult to apply as a way of keeping the rolls down. So cash assistance, last time I checked, was only being received by about 4 million people in the US. When you look at food stamps, it's like 50 million people. So there are other programs that are a much bigger part of anti-poverty efforts than than cash assistance, right? Because it's just become so impossible to apply for and get. And so, I have a lot of clients who, they're in the low wage workforce. They may be home health care workers, retail workers, although, the retail workers for the most part aren't back yet. They might work in hospitality, housekeepers in hotels. We're in Baltimore. We've had clients, who work part-time at the stadium in different capacities. We have a good bit of clients who are day laborers who don't have steady work. And so who are on, a street corner hoping to be picked up to do construction, painting work, that sort of thing. So we really see the full gamut of the low wage workforce.
Okay, so that's one bucket of government benefits is cash assistance, and it sounds like it's not a meaningful dent in poverty. You mentioned food stamps, and I hear all kinds of statistics. You may or may not have updated numbers. What are we talking about in terms of child hunger in the United States? And I mean, I watched a show once on Frontline with these children that you could have cereal or milk, but not both, or they get most of their nutrition is through their public school, which of course everything's frozen. It's not high quality food, but but for some of us, the idea that your child is hungry in America, what's happening there? And particularly with the pandemic, what are those numbers or statistics or a sense of what child hunger looks like in America, notwithstanding the food stamp program?
Yeah. So we like to think in America that we don't have problems with hunger and malnutrition. Sometimes we see these heart-wrenching pictures from developing nations of starving children, and we think, phew, at least we don't have that here. And while we may not have people starving to that degree, there are millions and millions of kids who go to bed hungry every day. There are millions of parents who forego their own food to feed their children. There are families who, are giving up meals per day. And those numbers have skyrocketed during the pandemic. I'm sure, everyone has seen on TV these mile-long lines at food banks because the need for food has gotten so extreme. So we do have very high rates of hunger in America. It's measured by the US Department of Agriculture in the terms of food insecurity and then like extreme food insecurity. And what those numbers are capturing is how many nutritional needs are not being met. And, I don't have the exact figures before me, but millions of families report food insecurity, and it has absolutely skyrocketed during the pandemic.
I mean, I had heard, and this may or may not be right, that it's 1 in 5 children and 1 in 4 children of color. I mean, you're nodding. I know you don't have the numbers at your fingertips, so this doesn't sound like that.
That sounds about right.
It doesn't surprise you. It doesn't surprise you.
No, it doesn't. And that's one reason during the pandemic that there have been efforts to keep like school lunch programs alive, even if schools are closed, because for some children, that's the only meal that they get a day. And so, when we closed schools, we didn't just limit educational opportunity. For many kids, that's where they get food and other social services. So that has had, really profound effects on a lot of families.
That's an amazing concept, right? That our education system is actually a food bank also for low-income kids. What about food stamps though, Michele? Don't they get food stamps? I mean, what is that? You just mentioned earlier, many, many more families, 50 million or whatever, will take, you can correct me the number, get food stamps. Why are these kids so hungry?
Food stamps is a very important program, but it also is limited. Gives you about $1.40 per meal, which is not a lot. And so for a lot of families, even if they are eligible and receiving food stamps, that money doesn't stretch for a full month. And so there may be more food, early in the month when people get their benefits, and then it trickles out by the end and people start getting very, very hungry. So again, it's a vital program. It's an important program, but it's not a lot of money. One semester, one of my classes took the food stamp challenge, which is to live on a food stamp diet for a week, right? So taking that amount of money and trying to live on it for a week. And the students were journaling about that experience. And Many of them were quite hungry, and some, for health reasons, had to stop the experiment. This was a voluntary assignment. I just want to throw out there. And people were just eating bags of beans and rice and jars of peanut butter because they could not get the food stamp amount to extend to a healthy, adequate amount of food. And these were law students who are young, healthy, in their 20s, and they couldn't make it work. And some of them were like circling around the law school, quote unquote, cheating, looking for events where pizza slices would be given out because they were, struggling to feed themselves. And so that was a very powerful, eye-opening experience for many of them, was just for 1 week to try and live on a food stamp budget. Very, very challenging.
Okay, last piece, and we're not going to talk about healthcare. Last piece, housing. You mentioned that is the number one, the biggest chunk out of most budgets now as compared to when the poverty level formula was established in the 1960s. What's available? What programs are available for low-income people to get government-supported housing in America?
Yeah, not enough. So something like 70% of families who are eligible for housing assistance don't get it because there's not enough of it. So I'll give you an example. In Baltimore City, which is where we both work, the wait list to obtain a housing voucher is closed with no plans to reopen it, meaning you can't even get on the list to get a voucher. Okay. The last time the Housing Authority opened up the wait list to get a housing voucher, which is provides a federal subsidy for a market rate home, 74,000 people signed up. That's how untapped the need is here. And only 1 of 3 was then chosen in a lottery to get a spot on the wait list. And even fewer of those folks are even likely to receive a voucher. So the need is immense, but the quantity of vouchers or spots in public housing, which is housing where the city is your landlord, are very, very limited. And so as a result, we have millions of low-income people living in substandard housing that's often a threat to life, health, and safety. It's inhabitable because that's all that they can afford. And even at those levels, most poor people are paying over 50% of their income on housing, and there's a good chunk paying over 70% of their income on housing. So we have a very serious housing affordability gap, and very little access to federally subsidized housing benefits.
So how does this come about? How does it happen? And you're also a professor of administrative law, which for non-lawyers is agency law. How does it happen that there's a law passed identifying eligibility criteria for a benefit that is housing, and then there's no housing? I mean, how does it happen that there's a disconnect there? Congress decides, oh, this is such a great idea. There's low-income people that need support from the government for housing. My constituency supports my voting for this, but then there's no housing. How does that happen?
Well, they decide how much money they want to spend, and it's a limited pool, and there's no promise to anyone that if you're low income, you'll get housing. It's just, we have this money and we'll spend it till it runs out. And that leaves a lot of people in a lurch. It's not, we talked about earlier how welfare used to be an open-ended entitlement. Housing doesn't work that way. There's a limited, amount, and when it goes, it goes. The last time the wait list for housing vouchers was open in Baltimore City was 2014.
Wow.
So I can't advise any client, let's get you on the wait list. You can't get on the wait list. It's closed. That is not an option.
So we've talked about established the situation in America around poverty. Super interesting. Do you have any insider knowledge into sort of the psychological effects of living in poverty? Because I think from the top of the show, you're mentioning there's a whole racist element around it, this myth that these people are lazy, and you mentioned your students trying to live on a food stamp budget. What does it do to any human being, you or me, put in that situation, psychologically, the stress levels to live like that? Is there
Yeah.
data on that?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a good point to make that to be a person experiencing poverty is more than just not having economic resources, right? It's living with a variety of deprivations. So, poverty, as we've talked about, it's associated with hunger, homelessness, poor health, both physical and mental health, lower quality education, toxic levels of stress that impact people's physical health. You know, it means you live in neighborhoods with higher levels of crime and violence. So to be a person experiencing poverty means a whole constellation of disadvantages, not just the economic one. That is just part of it. So even if you just look at food insecurity that we were talking about earlier, well, what does that mean for kids? We know it's associated with lower reading and math scores, physical and mental health problems, higher incidences of emotional problems, behavioral problems. It can affect their birth weight, their physical and mental development, increases the risks of obesity. I mean, I could go on, but each one of these deprivations then has its own constellations of harms that just ripple out. So child poverty alone costs the US government more than 1 trillion a year. That's a big number, $1 trillion a year, because one way or another, society pays for the consequences of sicker people, less educated people, people who end up being incarcerated. So the costs and the situation goes much beyond just income and income levels. And I think that's a really important point that you're raising.
It is. I mean, particularly given how this whole issue is branded or misunderstood, that it's about handouts or bleeding hearts or, left-wing, overly compassionate people that just want big government. But it sounds like you're making an argument that there's a steely-eyed economic rationale for addressing poverty that has nothing to do with politics or even these moralistic arguments against poverty.
Right. We would all benefit as a society from a healthier, safer, more educated population that has higher quality jobs. I mean, if I were a company, I need consumers who can pay for my goods and services, right? And so if we have a stratum of society that doesn't have the money to pay for goods or services, that's sort of a threat to like America and our capital system writ large. So the costs of poverty are really high, and not just for poor people. That's your point. We all pay a cost for poverty, and we are all, I think another interesting point is we are all in our way, subsidizing the low wages that corporate America is paying to workers. So, there was one study out of Berkeley that showed that taxpayers pay $153 billion a year for public assistance that low-wage workers turn to because they don't get paid enough, right? Another study that the General Accountability Office did, which is a nonpartisan office, found that 70% of 21 million SNAP, that's food stamps, or Medicaid recipients work full time. Where do they work? In many states, the biggest employers of public benefits recipients are Walmart or fast food outlets. And so, we can have fights over what would a $15 an hour minimum wage do in terms of, job creation. But the one thing I don't really hear in public debates is the fact is, if you don't raise it, Mr. or Ms. Taxpayer, you're subsidizing McDonald's wages. You're subsidizing Amazon's wages. You're subsidizing Walmart's wages because those low-wage workers need food stamps to make ends meet, often qualify for Medicaid in order to obtain health care. So it's like this idea, like someone pays the price. You can't escape it. Someone pays the price.
So that's, I think, just a tremendous insight. And you and I have discussed this, or I've heard you lecture on this to my students in my administrative law class, and it really surprised me. And that is this idea, okay, if we've got a federal budget where economists are worrying that we're borrowing too much, our deficit is way too high, And, one thing that one particular party in particular always goes for is entitlements, 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 cut entitlements. But it sounds like what you're saying is, on the other hand, we've got, okay, big corporations. We had a massive tax cut in 2017, massive tax cut from 30 something percent to 21% for corporations. And so they're making a lot, they're making lots of money. They're not paying their workers a living wage. If they paid them 15 or more, an actual living wage, maybe their profits would go down. But because these people are, as a result, living in poverty, the government taxpayer coffers then have to supplement that. So it's kind of like, where do you want to take the money? Take it out of the bottom line of big corporations to pay their workers a living wage, ease up on the taxpayer and these entitlement programs. That money, the $1 trillion you mentioned, could go somewhere else. Or Congress could continue to make it harder, easier on corporations, which puts more pressure on the taxpayer to do something about all of this constellation, and to use your word, of effects of the trauma of poverty. The trauma. It's almost like they're on the front line someplace. You're in a battlefield. You're in a war zone. You're human. It's going to have a problem. I think that's absolutely fascinating. How would you rebrand that, Michele? I mean, if you could, what would be your talking point? I mean, maybe you haven't thought about it, but welfare, we need to cut entitlement programs, trickle down economics, you allow corporations to make more money, that pumps money into the economy, and the boat fly, all boats go higher in the harbor, which, historically hasn't panned out. But how would you reframe the poverty argument then, or the branding?
Well, you're right. That trickle-down economics does not work. And there have been some studies out this year that establish that pretty definitively. I think the idea is that we can't consider poor people in isolation. We really have to recognize that we are all in this economy and the society together. And that if corporate America isn't going to pay a living wage, it's the taxpayer who picks up the bill. And you mentioned, many of these companies don't even pay federal taxes. I think Amazon hasn't paid any amount of federal tax for the last several years, but it's not just that. In addition to not paying taxes, they get billions in federal, state, and local subsidies, right? Often to attract businesses to an area, or to
they get welfare.
An area. There's corporate welfare, right? But why isn't that a bad word? That's seen as an accepted part of the game. And so you just see corporations winning, but workers are staying in place, or even, going backwards in terms of their financial footing. So we just sort of need to recalibrate our expectations of the role corporations play in America, and deal realistically with what low-wage workers are facing.
Okay, so big education lead up on poverty to the big COVID bill that President Biden signed.
The American Rescue Plan.
Yeah, American Rescue Plan, which, I think when I first looked at it, it wasn't discussed as an anti-poverty measure. But, I don't have your expertise, but I've read some anti-poverty experts who said, this was Christmas on Hanukkah, on Kwanzaa, times 1,000. We never ever would have expected anything even close to this. It was never seriously on the table. Can you tell us, what did that bill do for poverty? Kind of under the rug a little bit.
Yeah, it's going to be a very, very powerful and effective anti-poverty tool in the short term. So under the American Rescue Plan, every adult and child dependent is going to get a $1,400 check, right? Those are the stimulus funds. Sometimes people call them their stimmy checks are coming. It extended federal unemployment benefits through September, right? A recognition that the economy is coming back slowly. One of the most powerful things it does is increase the child tax credit for 2021. And the child tax credit has the potential to be a very profound anti-poverty tool. So it's an amount of $3,600 for each kid under the age of 6. and $3,000 for kids between 6 and 18. And almost all Americans, except for the most affluent, qualify for it. And that's new, because while we've had a child tax credit for a while in a significantly lower amount, it was really targeted towards middle-class families, and the poorest people who needed it the most weren't eligible, because it used to require earned income, and it was a credit against earned income. Now, that's not required anymore. So it's called a tax credit, but what it really is a guaranteed child income, which many of our peer countries have had for a long time and which we have never had. The catch here is it's only enacted for 2021. And so what we're hoping is that as people see how effective it is in easing child poverty and its associated harms, it will be enacted as a permanent part of the US tax code. We need to make that permanent, but it's very encouraging for this year. At the same time, I read a very compelling article in the Washington Post this week that for families who are already in significant debt, which is most poor families, that money is going to go out as soon as it comes in, right? To pay the past rent, to pay the credit card bills, to pay the utility bills. So while it's expected to have a tremendous effect, estimates are that it will cut child poverty by 50% for this year and overall poverty by 30%. Again, for most poor people, it's not like, they're going to be going to Disney World, because that money is going to go out the door to pay existing debts as soon as it comes in.
So is it fair to say it's almost like cash assistance in that, I mean, if I can reframe what you explained as far as I understood it, so you make $50,000 a year, you get a tax credit, you can take for a child, you can take a certain amount of money out of your income in terms of your base that the government taxes at the end of the year. But if you don't have a significant income, there's nothing to take the credit out of. So
right, that was the old system.
Under the old system. Mm-hmm. So now you're getting a credit, but it's actually regardless of income. So for some people, it will look like cash in their bank accounts that is tailored to the fact that they have children who need food and housing and etc.
Exactly. It's a guaranteed income for families with children. Again, many other wealthy countries have provided this for a long time. We have not. One thing to realize is our rates of poverty among senior citizens are much lower than for kids. And that's not an accident, right? For senior citizens, we have a program called Social Security. It's one of the greatest anti-poverty programs, in all of history. We have never committed to children in the same way. Why? I don't know. Children don't vote. They're not a powerful political constituency. There's distrust of poor kids' families. But these are choices. And one thing we know that solves poverty is money. Money brings people out of poverty. And one thing that I think is really great with these child tax credits that are coming in is families can choose how to spend them. They're not limited in how it gets spent. And so they're going to be able to choose to spend, in a line where their needs really are. For instance, with food stamps, obviously you have to spend it on food, but even within that category, there are restrictions. Here, families have the autonomy to spend the money in the way that will best meet their family's needs. But again, right now, this is only for 1 year. 1 year. So the goal is to get it, a permanent part of the tax code.
So do you have any sort of hypothesis after speaking about how corporations are getting welfare on welfare on welfare by not having a mandatory minimum wage so that they can underpay their workers, pocket that as cash? That bill goes to taxpayers. How did this bill get through and without any real public debate about it? And in that connection, invite you to explain to our viewers what reconciliation is.
I'll have to turn to you on that. But I think when we look at why did this pass, elections matter, right? Not a single Republican voted for the American Rescue Plan. And the only reason it passed is because Democrats did, and we have a Democratic president. And so we had the convergence of a party in power that is concerned with disadvantaged people in America, combined with this catastrophic pandemic that's been catastrophic for public health and for the economy, and greater willingness among, I think, the general public to realize, wow, people are suffering and it's not their fault. It's because of the pandemic. It's because of the economy. And so there's more compassion now for people in need. So you have this, once in a lifetime historic event aligning with people in power who are more attuned to the needs and concerns of low-income people. And part of the reason they're in power is because we face this catastrophic event, right? And so the public was looking for a party that was willing to effectuate change.
Well, we have some people that never thought they'd be in a food line, that, who are finding themselves living like this, never thought they would as a result of the pandemic. So compassion, self-interest, whatever, it did shift things. So reconciliation is, and I'm not a legislative expert either, but it's a one-time shot. The Congress gets the ability to pass a bill relating to financial legislation. There's some limits on it. And that only requires a bare 50%. It does not, the filibuster isn't triggered. So it didn't require the Republican support. And this is exactly how in 2017, the Republicans got the massive tax cuts through for corporations, was through reconciliation. But just so everyone knows, and this is kind of a light bulb that went off in my mind, if we like this American Rescue Plan and what this is doing, we need to pay attention to the midterm elections to keep a Democratic Congress going. Because this could be a one and done year, and then these people are even deeper, and the government, I should say the government, and the country as a whole are more in the crisis of poverty that, based on your explanation, affects everyone.
Yes, absolutely. There are certain parts of the American Rescue Plan that, aren't time limited just for this year, that make some positive changes. But yeah, this child tax credit is for the calendar year 2021.
So I know there are some other reforms coming down the pike. Joe Biden has said, the Biden administration's indicated the next big one is infrastructure. And, any sense of whether that bill or that plan could affect low-income Americans in a positive way?
Yeah, absolutely. I had the chance to read through the plan and to see President Biden talking about it yesterday. One thing it will definitely do is create jobs, and many of those jobs look like they will pay a living wage. So it will provide a lot of economic opportunity, especially as we climb out of the pandemic. But it will also improve the quality of life for people experiencing poverty. So there are commitments to making water safer, right? And dangerous, poisonous water is something that low-income communities face, not affluent communities. There's a commitment to rehabilitating millions of units of housing to make them both affordable, accessible, and safe. If we're improving transportation, then that helps all people, including low-income people, better access work. Just looking through the different proposals in the infrastructure plan, almost all of them will help people who are experiencing poverty.
And I know you're not an economist, but you are not just a poverty law expert, but an advocate, I think, for these issues. How do you respond to the argument that, listen, we can't pay for all this stuff?
Well, we chose to pay for a corporate tax break and a tax break on the richest Americans. So this is about our values. We can afford it. We're a very wealthy country. But it's going to, it takes all hands on deck. And at this point, I think it's untenable to keep giving economic benefits to the top 1% and neglect, the rest of the country. We can afford it. It's just a choice. We're choosing not to pay for these things up to this point in time. And many of them over time, will pay for themselves. right?
What do you mean by that? By
Well,
having,
as more people work and more people become taxpayers and more people can spend money on goods and services and get better educations and then, can climb up the economic ladder, everyone benefits. Trickle-down economics doesn't work, but a rising tide does, lift all boats. So, we really have to recognize more how we're all connected as a society, and the welfare of everyone in society impacts everyone else. So we can afford it. It's just, it's a choice.
it's a choice. And step one, at least in my view, and I think you probably agree, is education. So people understand the nuances. And you and I are amongst the most educated, probably, tier in America. And I learned so much in this conversation about poverty. So I want to thank you, Michele, for taking the time with me today, Simple Politics, to talk about these really, really crucial issues. And I hope we can circle back again to see, hopefully, how things turn out. And I say hopefully that it will be ongoing good news. That is, that some of these things will become permanent, the child tax credit in particular.
Yeah, me too. But we all have to keep advocating. We have to vote and we have to keep pressure on our elected officials. So we're all in it together.
Absolutely. Thanks again, Michele. Thanks everyone for watching. Have a good evening.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye. Yay.
All right.